the other thing I want to say is a good AT assessment should be about the feature matching to meet the individual's needs. So just like Universal Design for Learning, it's not a one-size-fits-all. I'm not a salesman, but I really do consider myself an AT evangelist, and I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't clearly explain the difference between ATLA and other service organizations or other service providers that may dabble in AT. When you as a SPED teacher have a student that you feel could benefit from AT tools, please encourage the IEP team to request a qualified AT specialist to do that evaluation. It doesn't have to be ATLA, but I do feel very passionate about students getting that AT evaluation and it being a good qualified AT evaluation. I will say that that's all ATLA does is AT. So that's our focus is AT. And so we have tools that a lot of school districts and a lot of service providers and other agencies just don't have or don't have access to or don't have the knowledge and the research of. So if the school will have that AT evaluation done, by all means, give us a call. So the other thing is when you're doing an IEP or your student is getting an IEP, there's minimal compliance for considering AT, and it's simply checking the yes or no in the consideration questions. But best practice would be to dictate that IEP teams use a systematic process for considering a student's AT needs and that those outcomes of consideration be addressed in the IEP. In so many instances, it's just as important to document when a student does not require AT as it is when a student does require AT. The other thing to keep in mind before I move on is decisions must be based on that child's unique and individualized need, not on what we do for all kids with a particular classification. And I know I keep going back to the Proloquo to Go, but it's just a really good example that a lot of kids were handed an iPad with Proloquo to Go on it, and it might not have been the most appropriate tool for them. The other one that I hear a lot of is students that need speech to text. The school will just buy Dragon Naturally Speaking, which is a really common AT software, and it might not be the best tool for the student. So there's a lot of classification of, oh, this student isn't able to write, so the only thing we're going to go out and buy is Dragon Naturally Speaking. And I get called in, or I get a call from a mom or a teacher or somebody, and the first question I always ask is, did anybody actually sit down and see if the student wanted Dragon Naturally Speaking? Is it something that was there feature matching to make sure that was the most appropriate tool for the student? And I can say at least 8 out of 10 times it's no, nobody even showed it to the student. That's what somebody chose. So I'm going to move on soon. But the other thing I get asked a lot when it comes to, especially when we're doing our AT evaluations, is what's the difference between the accommodations versus the modifications? The best way I can explain it is accommodations level the playing field while modifications change the field you're playing on. So in UDL, it's making a playing field that every kid can enjoy, but some kids need a different kind of a bat when it's their turn to hit the ball. AT is the different kind of bat that will accommodate their needs. They're still playing in the same game on the same field. they just hit the home run with a different bat than all of the other kids have. So maybe that analogy might come in handy someday when somebody asks you what the difference is between accommodations and modifications. Okay, so how does AT fit into the UDL standards? Let's pretend for a moment that you've worked really hard to implement that perfect UDL classroom and curriculum. It's January, and one of the students on the slide I jumped ahead a slide, sorry. On this slide, we're talking about how does AT fit into the UDL standard. Assistive technology is specifically considered for an individual student. That assessment, under universal design, it makes the general education curriculum accessible to students with varying needs, so all students. AT is used by a student to meet the expectations of the general education, where universal design is used by all students with diverse learning needs, and AT is monitored by special educators, but also used by general education teachers. In UDL, it's implemented by general education teachers and special education teachers. So there's where we kind of connect the two together. Okay, so on this slide, let's pretend for a moment that you've worked really hard. You've implemented that perfect UDL classroom and curriculum. And it's January, and one of the students on this slide has moved into your classroom. Does your ideal UDL classroom meet their needs, or do you need to provide accommodations? What's your first step? Then let's go on to this one. Same classroom, but now one of the students pictured on this slide has also moved into your classroom. Same questions. Does your ideal UDL classroom meet their needs, or do you need to provide additional accommodations? It's a tough question that all teachers are faced with. The challenge to provide accommodations and assistive technology is much greater for students on this slide than it is for the students on the first slide. So the next challenge is anticipating the needs of all students. So we go back to what is UDL. We need to be mindful of your design flexibility. There's a big difference between designing for all and retrofitting for one. Because if we retrofit for one, sometimes an inflexible UDL setup plus those AT accommodations can make it very dangerous. And this goes back to that example of those students that you can't visibly see what their disability is. Will your classroom under that UDL model fit their needs? And how can you make sure and provide those accommodations that it's not a death trap ramp or one that you've set up an obstacle in the middle of? So one of the examples that I'd like to share is I love the one-to-one initiative, where all students are able to have their own piece of technology, whether it's a Mac, a PC, an iPad, whatever it is, and they get to keep it the whole year, and then it just makes sense to me, the one-to-ones. But in the transformational change process required for a one-to-one technology initiative, school districts need to be careful that opportunities are equally available for all students. Some district personnel interpret, quote, providing opportunity as providing different or specialized supports to what is typical in the natural environment. Universally designing a one-to-one technology initiative means designing to provide the identical, when possible, and equitable with not. So providing identical requires providing enough flexibility on the front end of the design to reach the extremes of user differences. And I'm talking about those kids on the outside of our bell curve. So in a nutshell, if you're at some point part of a team that decides what technology to purchase because your school is now a one-to-one initiative, meaning each and every student gets a device, whether it's a PC, Mac, iPad, or whatever, keep those students that hang out on the sides of the bell curve in mind when choosing the technology. There's so many schools that have purchased one-to-one devices for the entire school and then have to go back and purchase something different for the 10 to 20% of the students that didn't meet accessibility needs because the wrong equipment was purchased. So just something to keep in mind, because one-to-one initiatives within schools are happening more and more often now. So the other thing is 26th annual report to Congress on IDA reported that approximately 96% of general education teachers have students in their classroom with some form of learning disability. One more very staggering statistic is that I read recently is today 57% of the students with disabilities spend more than 80% of their day in general education classrooms. Yet general education teachers consistently report that they do not have the skills they need to effectively instruct diverse learners, including students with disabilities. And we see this so often when we work within the schools. I've seen this quote is from this teacher, and I put the article in there. It's from Ed Week. It says, I've seen a dramatic shift in the way students with disabilities look at technology. They used to say they didn't want to use it because they'd be different. Now we know everyone learns in a different manner. I've also seen a shift dramatically in the same thing that this teacher was quoted saying in this article. When implemented correctly, AT can truly be life-changing for students, and I have high hopes that with the recent changes at the federal level, that change is going to continue to get ramped up. Okay, so I have a few kind of boring slides in here, but they're really important. First, as I just mentioned, there are big changes happening at the federal level, so in case you haven't heard, there's a new acronym on the education block called ESSA, E-S-S-A. On December 10th, President Obama signed the Every Student Succeeds Act, the ESSA, and it officially replaced the No Child Left Behind Act. This focuses on improving literacy instruction through two new initiatives that provide, first, some evidence-based strategies for educators and parents to effectively teach reading and writing to all students, including those who have learning disabilities, such as dyslexia. And secondly, it provides resources to identify and intervene when those students are struggling. Keep students with learning and attention issues on track to receive a regular high school diploma by allowing only students with the most significant cognitive disabilities, the 1% of the total student body, to be eligible for the alternate assessment-based or alternate achievement standards. Third, it requires annual assessments in reading and math in 3rd through 8th grade, and once in high school, to give parents, educators, and policymakers a better understanding of how a child is progressing and how schools are serving students overall. And fourth, it provides for a transparent public reporting on key metrics related to high-quality education. It's going to disaggregate those by subgroups, including students with disabilities, such as their performance on their annual assessments and access to advanced coursework and measurement of the school's climate. And then fifth, it requires school districts to implement an evidence-based intervention when students with disabilities consistently underperform, and to evaluate the schools based on criteria that strongly emphasized on academic performance. And so a new accountability system, but it's one that our state gets to decide on. It's not a federal one. And then lastly, it encourages innovation in education by supporting personalized learning, multi-tiered support, universal design for learning, as well as integrating technology and competency-based education initiatives. ESSA stands for Every Student Succeeds Act. And so at the end of my presentation, I have a ton of resources about it that I'm going to share with everyone.